Your eyes dart to the windows, night falling on the trees outside. You've babysat once or twice before, but the Johnson house backed into some woods, making for a really creepy evening, especially for someone who'd never been there before. But the Johnsons had been nice, if a little distracted. They'd hustled her through the rooms, ran off a list of phone numbers on the fridge, handed out some stern words to Cassie and Drew, and took off. And the kids hadn't been so bad. They were still pretty young, so a few board games had kept them happy until bed. There was a slight bump when it was time to brush teeth, and then another one when it was bedtime, but nothing you couldn't handle. You jump a little when the phone rings. It's probably the Johnsons checking in. But when you answer, it's silent. You give it a minute or two, asking hello a few more times before hanging up. You look over at the windows, the trees even darker. You're pulling the curtains shut when the phone rings again, so you answer. At first there's nothing, but then...
Have you checked the children?
Excuse me?
Have you checked the children?
The line goes dead. You stare at the phone in your hand. What do I do? You don't really want to call the Johnsons and freak them out over what could just be a prank call, but you reason that if Cassie and Drew were your kids, you'd want to know what was going on. But your call to the parents goes unanswered. You've only just returned the phone to its cradle when it rings again. The Johnsons must have just missed my call.
Why haven't you checked the children?
You slam the phone down, picking it back up to dial 911. You explain what's happened to the operator, putting special emphasis on the fact that this person's called multiple times. Keep calm. It could still be a prank, but I'll try to trace the call. When he calls again, keep him on the line as long as you can. Stay by the phone. The minutes tick by as you wait for the next call. You hadn't turned on the lights yet, but now you feel too scared to move to the switches. The darkness in the hallway to the stairs seems to stretch, a gaping mouth. Was that a footstep? A rustle of clothes? You yelp as the phone rings. Taking a deep breath, you pick it up. Heavy breathing, ragged and unsteady, and it just keeps going. You let it go for what you hope is a minute, but you can't stand it anymore. You hang up, tears in your eyes. The phone rings again. You finally snap. Yanking the phone up, you shout into the receiver, "Leave me alone!" But the voice that comes through is the operator. "Get out of the house. He's inside the house. Get out now!" You stop breathing, clutching the phone so hard you think the plastic might snap. The operator continues to shout down the line, but you can't speak. A light turns on, out in the stairway. Maybe the light should have made you feel safer, but you see a shadow cast down the stairs. Neither of you move, though you can hear a repeated tapping. You watch the shadow of something dark dripping from his hand. Happy Halloween, and welcome to Back Away Slowly. Today we're looking at the legend that inspired a plethora of Halloween favorites, The Babysitter and the Man Upstairs. While known as a scary story to all, its relevance appears to be directed more towards young girls, because, chances are, most little girls are going to babysit at least once. But as I looked into this story, I had some questions. It's terrifying, certainly, but isn't it kind of outdated? We have smartphones and location services now. Has that taken the teeth out of the legend's bite? It seems not, as the undertow of context runs uncomfortably close to issues in the present day. Seems to be a running theme this season. On the surface, it seems to be obvious what makes the story scary, but as we've learned, it's hardly that simple. So let's figure out who the babysitter is, who the intruder is, why they're in this situation, and what this story means. First things first. we'll take a look at various versions of the story to see how things have changed over time. The intro I just read was the general plot to most versions, but there are a few specifics to explore. Author N.E. Genge paints the picture of our first iteration in his book from 2000, Urban Legends. 15-year-old Jennifer is asked to babysit a couple's 3 children. Despite her age and being outnumbered, she proves herself to be totally capable and puts all of the kids to bed. The story gives us the specific detail that she's watching the network premiere of While You Were Sleeping, which gives us the year of this story, 1995. The phone rings, so she picks it up. A cackling punches through the line before a voice hisses,
"I've got the children. I've got the children. I've got the kids."
Annoyed by this obvious prank, she hangs up, but it calls again.
"I've got the children. I've got the children. I've got the children."
She again hangs up, turning up the TV, but the shrill ringing still cuts through. She considers calling the parents to ask what she should do, but she's nervous that this could be someone she knows. Maybe someone had called home and been given this number? She decides to call the phone company instead. The operator takes note of her complaint and says he'll try to trace the calls, but she'll have to answer the phone again. She curls up to wait. The next time the phone rings, she lets it go for as long as she can stand. She's about to check the kids and the door locks when the phone rings. It's the operator. "Look, we can't trace this to an outside line. It must be coming from an extension inside the house. I've called the police. Get out. The kids, get out." She's barely made it to the front lawn when a heavy man barrels into her. Quote, she can smell his breath, feel the handle of a heavy knife protruding from the fist pulling her hair. Jennifer knows she's about to die. She's almost blinded by headlights and a flashing of red and blue. She's seconds away from death when the police drag the maniac off of her. The other officers storm the house, finding the children bound and gagged in their beds, but alive. This feels like a very sterile version of the story, lifelong trauma aside. For a man determined to kill a slightly older child, it's perhaps unrealistic that he left the remaining 3 kids alive. But it leaves us without any permanent fears, as it assures the listener of the capabilities of the adults that Jennifer contacted, and that they'll naturally arrive in the nick of time. Nick Harding's book, Urban Legends from 2006, has the next iteration. This story goes as we know it, except the girl's watching 2 children. When she picks up the ringing phone, she's met only with hysterical laughter. In every call he makes, the maniac doesn't say a single word, only laughing. When the operator tells her to get out, she runs for the door. As she does, a man descends the stairs, still laughing hysterically, covered in blood and carrying a large butcher knife. She runs into the street as the police arrive, but as I'm sure you've predicted by now, the ending isn't quite so kind to the children this time. In a story from Columbus, Ohio, in the winter of 1969 to 1970, the stranger has a strict schedule to keep. The first call comes at midnight, the second at 1 a.m. This time, a female operator gives the babysitter her instructions to leave. When the police enter the house, they find that both of the little girls the babysitter had been watching had been strangled. Somehow, they're able to determine that each little girl had been killed an hour apart, coinciding with the intruder's phone calls. The story wraps up by saying that this happened to, quote, our junior varsity coach's girlfriend's sister. A real friend of a friend story. An account collected at a Girl Scout camp in Indiana in October 1976 has a more scattered assailant, or possibly the details were jumbled because the storytelling took place in a group, the other girls shouting out details or comments. So, in the first call, the intruder says, quote,
"You had better get out of your house in 10 seconds or else I'll come down there and kill you. I'll kill you."
But then on the second call, he's a bit more generous with his timeline. Quote,
You better get out of your house in 9 minutes or else I'll kill you.
A version collected by folklorist Linda Day also reports the killer as being more methodical. This story was specifically collected by student Sylvia Gritter on February 21st, 1973. The babysitter cooks for the kids, plays with them, and puts them to bed at about 7:30. When she answers the first phone call, the stranger says, quote,
At 10:30, I'm going to kill the children, and then I'm going to come after you.
A half hour later, he calls back to deliver the same message, verbatim. The third time, he says, quote,
It's getting closer to the time, and I'm going to come after the children, and I'm going to get you too.
Enough is enough. Time to call the police. When the operator calls back after the trace, he says, quote, Get out of the house immediately. Don't go upstairs, don't do anything. Just you leave the house. When you get out there will be policemen outside, and they'll take care of it. Although her instinct is to go to the children, she reasons that if the operator had given her those instructions, it was for a reason. Outside, the police inform her that they traced the calls to an upstairs extension in the house. The children don't walk away from this, but I question if this intruder was more werewolf than man. Why? Because the children had been torn to pieces. Some versions of the story have the operator tell the babysitter, "Don't look back." If you haven't already, I recommend listening to our last episode where we explored that specific trope and its significance over the course of centuries in the Hookman and the Boyfriend's Death episode. Needless to say, the babysitter choosing to listen to this authority figure is why she survives these more gruesome iterations. But in the worst versions, the parents arrive at the same time as the police do. As the police are preoccupied with wrestling down the intruder, the parents go into the house to discover their slaughtered children. There is one iteration from Brunvon's 1981 book, The Vanishing Hitchhiker, that adjusts the story significantly, providing a surprise that doesn't follow the pattern we've seen so far. The story, collected in 1976, took place on August 8, 1969. The babysitter is watching the Smith children, aged 5 and 7. She just put the children to bed when the first call comes through. Quote,
I'm upstairs with the children. You'd better come up.
Fast forward to when 10 cop cars arrive. The officers hustle upstairs to find the 7-year-old son sitting next to the phone with a tape recorder. As it turns out, the kid didn't like his parents going out and leaving them with a sitter. When he'd explained his woes to a neighborhood boy, the kid suggested this plan in an attempt to scare off the sitter. I'm not sure how this 7-year-old got a recording of a man saying these exact lines, but it's still an intriguing deviance. Our last story comes from Tom Baker's 2010 book, Scary Urban Legends. Sarah is going to babysit the Thompson twins for Halloween night. Mr. Thompson answers her knock, shaving cream still on half his face. He doesn't even greet her, he just calls for his wife and hustles away. The book even notes that he has a reputation for being rude and unfriendly. Maleva Thompson walks Sarah through the house, coming across her sons, Billy and Jimmy, while on the tour. Jimmy asks Sarah if she'll read his comic book to them, and Billy is quite young, as he just chews on his robot. The story also specifies that Maleva is speaking slowly, English not being her first language. Maleva says the kids should be in bed at 8, and that they'll be home sometime after midnight. Quote, also, you aren't expecting any visitors tonight, are you? I understand that this is a very important holiday for American school kids. I've left a big bag of candy for trick-or-treats, but Billy and Jimmy can only have a few pieces each. I don't want them making themselves sick before they go to sleep. Sarah nods as Maleva says all this, not telling her that her own football player boyfriend, Jake, is going to come over to keep her company. Sarah plays games with the boys, puts on a Bela Lugosi movie, makes them burgers, fries, and caramel corn, and hands out candy to trick-or-treaters. She's a little worried as she puts the boys to bed. She hadn't heard from Jake all night. She's channel surfing when the phone rings. There's only breathing on the other end, so she hangs up. When it rings again, the caller says, quote,
I can see you standing there in the kitchen, and I know you're alone with the children, Sarah.
This feels very Scream, to the point I wonder how old this story is, though the book I got the story from was published in 2010. Sarah calls the police, who think it might be a prank, but they'll try to trace the call anyway. The operator calls back, the caller's in the house, get out, yada yada. Now this is the only story I found where the babysitter grabs the biggest butcher knife she can find and climbs the stairs. The light in the hall is turned off, but she can see a hulking shadow in the moonlight. The shape is wearing a cheap rubber mask and carrying a bloody knife. Instead of fleeing in terror, Sarah screams, pitching forward and stabbing him in the shoulder. They both tumble down the stairs in the scuffle. The intruder's bleeding badly now, the knife stuck in his chest. He pulls off the rubber mask, and Sarah gasps as she sees that it's her boyfriend, Jake. There's a variation that steps to the side a bit, though it's probably familiar to listeners who have spent a lot of time on spooky forums. I've seen this story retold over and over again on Reddit, some trying to claim that they either experienced it or that the writer came up with the story. Marcy Parkinson is going over to the Green's house to babysit. There's added details, such as Mr. Green being an insurance salesman, and therefore able to afford a fairly large home with, quote, a 2-car garage, a huge lawn in front and back, full of antiques. Strangely, the parents leave before even introducing the kids to the stranger who will be watching them that night. Marcy has to go upstairs and introduce herself to Timmy and Sandra, so I think we can assume that the parents also didn't show her around the house to let her know where things are, either. This is used to explain why they don't immediately find the intruder, but if you have any sense of realism when you listen to this story, it just comes off as bizarre. An interesting component to this rendition is that the plot wastes no time in getting the story moving. Like, I don't think the parents are all the way out of the driveway when stuff starts happening. After Marcy introduces herself to the kids, she walks past the parents' bedroom, but she stops and walks backward to look through the doorway again. Inside of the, quote, gloomy bedroom, seriously, what is going on with these parents? She sees a life-sized clown statue wearing a, quote, ragged hobo clown outfit with a red button nose, frizzy orange and blue hair, and weird makeup around the eyes. Marcy gets very close to it, shocked at how lifelike it looks. Its eyes seem to follow her around the room. Wait, did she just hear breathing coming from it? She isn't sure. She starts walking towards the door, but turns around. There. Isn't that arm further out than before? She stares at the clown for a long time, but seeing nothing else out of the ordinary, other than a life-sized clown statue in the parents' bedroom, she goes to watch TV, trying to calm down. But again, what vibes were these parents giving off that made her think that having a clown in their bedroom would be a reasonable thing they'd have? She hears the kids playing upstairs, so she goes to check on them. But she freezes for a moment, as she thinks she heard something else moving. Walking into the room, one of the kids smiles at her. "Oh, hi Marcy. Mr. Clown's been keeping us company while you've been downstairs watching the tube. He's so friendly. Comes in every once in a while to check on us, too." Marcy laughs this off as the kid's imaginations. You could call bullshit many times before this, but I don't know. This is where I throw in the towel. I'd understand blowing it off more if she hadn't seen the incredibly lifelike clown herself. Mr. Green calls to check on them, something we haven't heard of in the main storyline of the urban legend. The plausibly deniable needs of the plot has created a bizarre set of parents, but at least they check on their kids and the new babysitter. Marcy reassures him that everything's been going great, but out of curiosity, where did they find that giant clown statue? The line goes silent for a moment, before Mr. Green says, quote, "Clown statue? Marcy, we don't own any big clown statue." Marcy insists that there is one, but Mr. Green cuts her off. Quote, "Marcy, I want you to listen to me very carefully. Yes, we don't own any clown statues. I'm hanging up now and dialing 911. You get the kids and get out of there, now. Do you understand me? We're coming home right now." Mr. Green hangs up, and Marcy hears maniacal laughter coming from upstairs. Quote, "She flung open the door, her eyes growing wide, and she screamed so loud she could be heard all the way down the block, as her eyes took in the most horrifying sight she had ever seen in her life." Okay, now don't shoot the messenger. This is where the story ends. The group of boys telling the story just go to bed. I think this is an attempt at the human imagination will create something far scarier than whatever you can put to books or film, but it just doesn't work here. Thanks for nothing, Tom Baker. Now we'll break apart the elements of the story, exploring their histories, and analyze their purposes and significance. We'll start with the construct of babysitting at large, walking it forward to the present day. A significant portion of this section came from the book Babysitter, An American History by Miriam Foreman Brunell. It was enormously helpful for this episode, and if you have any interest in further reading, I really recommend her book. While I'm sure we could go back as far as the creation of man, today we're only going to go back to colonial America, as we're trying to trace the history of American babysitting. Mothers relied heavily on their daughters, putting a large amount of responsibility on them to help raise their younger siblings. This demand sometimes extended to boys, but not nearly as frequently, as this was often waved away as training for motherhood. On southern plantations, enslaved African American children were forced to care for their owners' children, as well as other enslaved kids. Adolescent girls from middle-class Victorian families would attend to younger cousins or work for a governess to earn money for their families. Foreman Brunell explains that specifically Victorian-era young girls who looked after children were viewed as, quote, little better than idiots. And unfortunately, the Victorian perspective about how families should function, gender roles, when childhood ended, how leisure time should be spent, and appropriate sexuality, all of these elements would shape how middle-class employers and parents looked down on working-class women taking care of their kids, viewing them as, quote, cultural inferiors. Although the 1920s saw changes and improvements to women's voting rights, the same couldn't be said about family expectations of women. And because of the progress made in women's rights, there was a massive wave of advertisements and, quote, experts who tried to beat back the progress by insisting that, quote, self-fulfillment for women can only be found in caretaking, consumption, and cleaning. Despite their best efforts, young mothers between the ages of 20 and 35 were parenting and getting jobs to make money, and it had men stressed. With so many women trickling into the workforce, there was now a gap in childcare. Hiring a nurse or governess with, quote, both the cultural background and the wholesome personality needed was expensive, and becoming increasingly difficult to find. With those governesses being so rare, parenting guides started to warn busy mothers about hiring high school girls, quote, who trundled babies about to hockey games, basketball practice, and engaged in street corner flirtation. Again, this was an attempt to spook mothers back into the home to pursue more appropriate behaviors. In the 1920s, most middle-class girls weren't very interested in babysitting anyway. They usually got their spending money from weekly allowances from their parents who didn't really encourage their daughters to work for money. Those parents were part of the generation that was bitching and moaning about the, quote, growing insolence and independence of the younger generation, which pushed feminine respectability beyond traditionally acceptable borders. But those daughters were still insisting on going out in the evenings to have a social life, weekday or weekend. These teens were pissing everyone off, their parents, as well as the people who were looking for help with their children, by making it abundantly clear that, quote, they neither had the time nor the inclination to sit at home or at the neighbors. It was such a hypocritical stance that these adults were taking. They were so eager to push adult responsibilities onto these girls, but then they'd turn around to shame them for wanting independence and adult lives. Apparently, independence was only acceptable if the teens were independent in conservative ways, in ways that were convenient for the adults, and convenient to exploit. Because yeah, I don't think a lot of young girls would be chomping at the bit to run motherhood practice drills, especially when society at large expected them to become real mothers at childhood's end. They wanted the freedom to live it up while they could, rather than be trapped in the traditional home early. The Great Depression really shook up this landscape, because suddenly there wasn't the freedom of choice when it came to spending money or childcare options. Since most of America was under threat of, or already in, poverty, young girls had no choice but to go to work to help their families. Marketers, taking note of the money the girls were earning via babysitting, advertised to young girls, specifically with campus fashion clothing. But other adults shamed these same girls for showing interest in such frivolous things, when they could barely afford the basics. Quote, "The rise of bathroom mirrors, the decline of disfiguring facial diseases, and the expansion of beauty culture enabled adolescent girls to spend more time experimenting with their appearance." Again, everyone seemed to have an opinion about what girls should be and how they should be living, doing their best to shame or punish those who didn't conform. But things rarely go how an oppressor wills it, as young girls simply hid their cosmetics and waited until they went to a friend's house or to babysit at a neighbor's. This would plant the seed of suspicion that the grown public had against teenage girls, that they were clearly hiding their true activities in the pursuit of selfish gains. And while we, today, are certainly not perfect when it comes to cultural clashes or racism, the era of the Great Depression had many adults who still expected their daughters to participate in romantic couplings that befit their status and race. But times were changing. Not enough, but they were changing nonetheless. And adults were horrified at the growing girls' insolence towards these racist values, as well as maternal responsibilities. The quote, "deceptively simple stereotype of the unruly babysitter expresses the anxieties of parents as well as the concerns of the culture about teenage girls. Let to do as they please, girls will recklessly transgress the essential boundaries between private and public, family and community, labor and leisure, childhood and adulthood, girlhood and womanhood, love and lust, reality and fantasy, culture and chaos, yours and theirs." With the men off fighting in World War II, babysitting became almost a requirement. With their mothers working at the factories and fathers off at war, America rebranded babysitting as the teens' patriotic duty. Nothing illustrates this better than Norman Rockwell's painting, The Babysitter. Published as the cover for the Saturday Evening Post of November 8, 1947. In this painting, a 12-year-old girl struggles to hold a red-faced, squalling baby. Despite the child yanking the shit out of her hair, the girl stares determinedly at an open manual titled The Babysitter. The room is a bit of a mess, with dolls, toys, and papers strewn about. It seems that the young sitter brought her homework with her, as a textbook titled American History, a stack of papers, and a pencil are stuffed beside her in the chair. An empty milk bottle sits on the floor, though it seems to have done little to satisfy the baby. At her ankle is an unmissable clock, about the size of the baby's head. The painting is gorgeous, packed with detailed wallpaper and floral upholstery. Special attention is paid to the babysitter's stern face, the chubby legs and feet of the baby, the draping blankets. I'll admit, I'm a bit of a sucker for Rockwell's work. There's an adorable article titled Not Just the Girl in the Painting, published in the Saturday Evening Post on March 6th of this year, 78 years after the original publication. What's really cool is that the author is the grandson of the original model for the babysitter in the painting. Author Theodore Holton Jr. writes about his childhood, passing the framed copy of the babysitter. He was eventually told by his dad that the spunky, red-haired girl in the piece was his grandmother. Images in the article include the Norman Rockwell painting of the babysitter, as well as a photo of 90-year-old Lucille Holton holding a copy of the magazine. She would pass away later this year, but the article functions as a beautiful tribute from grandson to grandmother. Lucille's face would light up any time she got to talk about being a part of the project, as she obviously loved being a part of such an iconic piece of American history. And though we're going to talk about the symbolism and cultural effects that this piece had at the time, and not all for the better, I'm glad that Lucille got to have such a magical experience, and that her participation provided such a lasting bond with her family. While I love the Rockwell piece from an artistic standpoint, the ideals that it exposes are pretty grim. This girl is barely in her teens, and yet she's already expected to embrace her future womanly role, unsupported and alone. She's supposed to keep up with school, and of course it's the most patriotic subject matter, all while being sure that childcare comes first. The mess of toys, the milk bottle, the schoolwork, the instructional pamphlet, the enormous clock. This girl is trying to tread water while being crushed by responsibility from all sides. This child clearly doesn't have much of a childhood, despite still being in it. And the fact that this piece was a cover in an iconic magazine, it really gives us a bold image of what society expected from girls at the time. In 1960, 1 in 5 mothers with children under the age of 6 had become wage earners. At the same time, children between 6 and 17 had also become wage earners. As the years passed, the pressure by society to be the perfect mother created feelings of inadequacy in the generation of young mothers who'd grown up sandwiched between historical ideals versus the progressive direction that society was taking. America couldn't get rid of babysitters, but they also couldn't really control them, despite their best efforts. The anxiety and fear from this lack of control created exaggerated fears about the increasing freedoms and chafing behaviors of teenage girls. Quote, different representations of babysitters arose, in which the babysitter cunningly shifted between wage earner and dutiful daughter, childcare provider and housekeeper, maternal surrogate and stand-in wife, submissive lover and destructive bitch. And with that quote, I'm going to give you a heads up that if you already didn't like how these young girls were being treated, this is going to go in a really gross direction. The sexual liberation of the 60s, as well as the invention of the pill, only stoked these ridiculous fears. But there was nothing the conservative public could do to stop the movement, and feelings of incredulous irritation turned into bitterness and anger. Since they couldn't stop the actions of the adults, they instead turned their anger towards literal children. As Foreman Brunel writes, quote, during the 1960s, female adolescents' claims to sexual independence led babysitters to become objects of masculine desire, in often leering fantasies in magazines and movies. The pleasures and perils of the sexual revolution and the counterculture were manifested in babysitters, who were widely and blatantly eroticized in everything from pornography to high culture. Soon, plot lines started to pop up everywhere of the sexual promiscuous teenage babysitter that would set her sights on the patriarch of the family she worked for. George Hughes painted Babysitter at Beach Stand in 1954, depicting a babysitter in a purple one-piece, long legs on full display, toting a baby stroller. As she sips a soda, a hot dog vendor glares at her, his face ugly with disapproval, as he heats up a baby bottle in a pan. The cover of the 1963 book The Babysitter, illustrated by Paul Rader, has a blonde teen, crop top just barely tied across her breasts. The byline reads, quote, "She was jailbait, a teenage man trap with a talent for trouble and a weakness for married men twice her age." There's even a 1970 movie called Weekend with the Babysitter, the tagline reading, quote, "She came to sit with baby and went away with daddy." Words cannot express how gross it felt to read that. Horny men took their own anxiety of female liberation and twisted it into something that would benefit them, regardless that the targets of their lust were children. It was a way to exercise control of these young girls, who seemed to be gaining more and more independence with each passing day. Consuming pornography featuring babysitters gave a superficial satisfaction in regaining some control, doing so with an activity that many men perceived as an expression of manliness. An added threat of their husband's wandering eye also prompted anxiety in their wives. Instead of holding their husbands accountable for this pedophilic interest, they instead looked at these little girls as vixens in disguise, actively trying to ruin their marriages. And so, in one fell swoop, the attitude of adults fully turned on these little girls, all while the men thrived in the perceived attentions of both teens and their wives. We need to talk a little bit about the status of men in parallel to women and teenage girls in order to really understand how this happened. During the Great Depression, the inability for the, quote, head of the household to provide for his family became a festering sore spot in the American family unit. It didn't matter that there were numerous reasons for why providing had become so difficult, many of which were out of the hands of the typical American citizen. At the end of the day, the family unit at large was struggling, and the men had to accept help from wherever they could to survive. And from the perspective of the antiquated ideals of the time, that was humiliating. Then World War II came along. When men came home from war, they found families that had managed to survive without them. And when they tried to elbow women out of the workplace and back into the home, they were met with resistance. Women working for themselves reinforced the feeling of inadequacy that had taken root. Women could survive without men. The ideal of the head of the household had been a source of pride for seemingly time in memoriam. But now, what felt like a guarantee that a man would have power and control no matter what. Who were they without that power and control? Many would fight this new status quo, trying to force things back to the way it used to be. But men couldn't control women the way they once had, with the option of divorce now available to women. So who else could these angry, disillusioned men control? Well, adults had a natural authority over children and teens, so that was an option. But because the American government had painted babysitting as a patriotic duty, men couldn't really say that babysitters were being rebellious. These girls had just been doing their patriotic duty by babysitting, so they couldn't argue that these girls shouldn't be working. It had been accepted that they hadn't done anything wrong, so how could men justify their anger towards these teens? Teens who they feared would grow into even more independent women than even their own wives. And that's how we got to where the perspective of these young teens shifted into sexual beings, as a way to justify the anger of men towards the new status quo. And it hit a hell of a lot of birds with one stone. The first, as we mentioned, was providing a distracting anxiety for their wives to worry about. If women had to be concerned with these literal children stealing their husbands, it might encourage their wives to be more dutiful in their womanly duties in order to keep their husbands' attentions. And where these grown older women would otherwise function as role models or supports for teens, now they inadvertently joined the ranks against them. It also turned the independence of teens into a red flag. Clearly, these young women were choosing to be sexually promiscuous, choosing sexual adult actions. If they were choosing to be sexual, had chosen independence, were adult enough to choose, then creating the countless pornographic pieces of Babysitters wasn't that bad. The girls had pushed for their independence, to which society horrifyingly said, "You want to be an adult so bad? Then you'll be an adult in every way." As the trope of teenage seductress became more widespread, it created another justification for the anger of these men. This young hussy thinks she can walk into my house, have authority over my children, and come between my marriage? Though many would hypocritically be attracted to this trope at the same time, with no repercussions or accountability. This whole section is horrible and wrong for many reasons. Seriously, I felt queasy writing it. But I'm also thinking, pick a lane. Either you want to be seen as the all-powerful man of the household, the backbone of society, the level-headed leaders of America, or you're a pedophile that's easily swayed by these child vixens, all-powerful or manipulated by children. And again, and I cannot express this enough, these are children. According to Babysit.com, in an article written by Matthew Taylor, when asking for the average age of babysitters over time, 65% of babysitters were 11 to 13 years old. 11 to 13 years old. Even if you take the next step up, 30% have been ages 14 to 17. By 1974, with the increased divorce rates, American dads struggled with custody of their children. Without women to handle everything at home, men found themselves tugged back and forth between the demands of their job and the needs of their children, despite women managing to do the same thing. This created a burning resentment and often outright hostility towards women, whom they viewed as responsible for their struggles. One gender historian writes, quote, "They subjected their female coworkers to varying degrees of harassment. Some even beat their wives and children out of sheer frustration of not being able to stem the tide of changing expectations." Foreman Brunel further elaborates, quote, "Men fought to preserve their prerogative and to assert their dominance at home, at work, in sports, and in the cultural imagination. One media scholar theorized that, quote, the horror film plays out the rage of a paternity denied the economic and political benefits of patriarchal power." And not to worry, we'll be digging into the relevant horror films a little later. Going back to the legend, let's talk about the use of the telephone. Making a phone call is so ordinary to us that we don't even give it a second thought. According to Call Me Maybe, Telephonic Romances and the Female Voice, 1880 to 1920, by Stefan Schoberlein, in the 1940s, the telephone was viewed as a very romantic device, and therefore more feminine. After centuries of writing letters that took weeks or even months to arrive, the idea of a loved one being able to whisper in your ear must have been quite the development. And because female voices speak in a tone that can be better transmitted via telephone, women soon dominated the field of switchboard operators. The economic boom after World War II meant that the American public began to be able to afford to have their own telephones in their homes. The telephone was soon a cornerstone across the country. For teenage girls in particular, media scholar Mary Celeste Kearney writes that, quote, the telephone functioned as a signifier of girlhood, simultaneously representing girls' liberation from the domestic sphere while also suggesting a method for their containment within it. But in the urban legend, the killer takes the babysitter's tool of the trade and turns it into an instrument of terror, reveling in the power he now has over something that otherwise would have given her comfort. This violent male stranger has monopolized the tool with which teenage girls connect to their support system. In a world of shifting gender norms and independent women, the angry intruder is doing his best to silence this young girl. But now it's time to look at other ways the babysitter's peril has been portrayed. That's right, it's time to get to the slashers. The Sitter is a 1977 short film, a beat-for-beat interpretation of the babysitter legend. Only 22 minutes long, the film was shot on a minuscule budget of $12,000. March 21st, 1972. The Mandrakis are getting ready to go out for the evening. When babysitter Jill arrives, Dr. Mandrakis is actually quite warm and welcoming, encouraging Jill to help herself to the fridge, while Mrs. Mandrakis bustles around, messing with her earrings, writing down phone numbers. This is a bit of a reverse of the stereotype we've explored. Here, the father is more emotionally supportive, and not in a creepy, predatory way. The Mandrakis don't introduce Jill to the children, as they're already asleep. While I wonder if this was a way to avoid having child actors in the short, I do think it accomplished what the clown story could not. Give a fairly reasonable excuse for why the adults and sitter don't find the intruder immediately. If the kids are asleep, of course the parents won't risk waking them. There's a clever bit of filmmaking when we cut from the well-lit living room to different shots of the shadowy house. We hear a dial tone as the camera pans through the dark house, turning the corner to see the island of light that is the living room. The camera slowly creeps forward out of the dark towards Jill's back, giving us, as the viewers, the impression that we are the intruder, scouting out our next victim. Foreman Brunel points out that, as we watch the movie, the story, quote, further punished girls by placing the audience in the uncomfortable role of an accomplice to an obsessive, sadistic voyeur. We're placed in the perspective of the peeping Tom, watching her discomfort and terror, all for our own entertainment. The friend on the phone with Jill tries to invite herself and Jill's crush over to the house, but Jill's annoyed at her suggestion. The friend is kind of incredibly rude.
You know what your problem is, Jill? Is you're so straight. I really mean that. You go to private school, you wear a bra. No one can have a good time with you.
Jesus, sorry I won't let you get drunk at the house of a family I met less than an hour ago. They manage to patch the conversation up a little, and Jill asks her friend to pass the house's number to her crush. I was a little perturbed by this, but we have to remember that without cell phones, the only way you can make a call was by passing around the number of the home you happen to be at. She picks up the first phone call, but the line's silent. An androgynous voice responds on the second call.
Have you checked the children?
What?
A bit of time passes now, and we see that Jill's lit a cigarette to calm her nerves. This brings up a bit of a question. We've seen Jill turn down the opportunity to party, and possibly even have sex. So will that be enough to protect her? Or will her engagement in other forbidden activities doom her? We'll have to see. Another call, and yet another. Jill pours a drink, again prompting the question of the ethical checks and balances that are weighing her life. After another call, Jill tries to call the number that Mrs. Mandrakis left for her. The call connects, but the staff inform her that the Mandrakis left the restaurant 40 minutes ago, and Mrs. Mandrakis had mentioned that they might go to a movie after dinner. This is an additional spot where this short plugs some plot holes. We can't ask why the sitter didn't just call the adults, because she tried, but now she's out of ways to contact them. With that option being a dead end, she instead calls the police. They suggest the idea of blowing a whistle into the phone to deafen the caller, or to leave the phone off the hook, but Jill can't risk the parents being unable to reach her. 2 more calls. The camera shows us several cuts of various rooms, making us uncomfortable with the size of the unfamiliar house. In a bit of a shift, the caller doesn't stay on the line to bask in her discomfort. He just hangs up. This also builds tension when the police tell her that she needs to keep him on the phone for a minute. How is she going to do that when he hasn't stayed on the phone for longer than a sentence? Unfortunately, that means she has to sit on the line, prompting the man with questions and entertaining his sick fantasy.
Who are you? I won't be here much longer. The doctor and his wife are coming home soon.
I know.
Can you see me?
Yes.
I'm sorry I turned the lights down. It didn't work anyway. I can turn them back up if you'd like.
Don't.
Don't? You've really scared me. Is that what you wanted? Is that what you wanted?
No.
Well, what do you want?
Your blood all over me.
Coven writes, quote, "We all remember what our parents told us about obscene phone callers. To hang up immediately, or, as the police officer on the phone in When a Stranger Calls, a film explicitly based on this legend, suggests, to blow a whistle loudly into the phone, deafening the caller. What we are warned not to do is to engage with the caller in any kind of conversation. That is what usually he, wants." Ironically, in Black Christmas and When a Stranger Calls, as well as the legends themselves, the babysitter or sorority girls have to keep the caller on the phone so that the police can trace the calls back to the house the girl or girls are in. When that interdiction is broken, by engaging directly with the obscene caller, the results are tragic. He seems to call right back, and Jill's nerves are absolutely frayed.
Jill, this is Sergeant Sacker. Listen to me. We've traced the call. It's coming from within the house. A squad car's on its way over there now. Just get out of that house. You understand me?
The phone rings again, almost taunting her, but she edges her way to the front door. The upstairs light turns on. Jill struggles with the chain on the door, eventually yanking it open to reveal a bizarre editing choice. A high scream rattles my speakers, and there's a bored-looking man in a tie standing at the doorstep. So, they cut from her fleeing the house in terror right to when a detective arrives to investigate the case, about a half hour later. The babysitter's gone, so we have to rely on the expositional conversation by the cops to figure out what happened. The intruder was still upstairs when they arrived, covered in the children's blood. The kids had been dead for several hours. When the detective asks about the babysitter,
"How about the babysitter? She's gonna be all right."
it's a really weird tone to take, as the parents sit just behind the cops, staring at the floor in shock. The cop says his line, and it abruptly cuts to some credits that pop up over footage of the phone. It's really bizarre. So we have some conflicting messages. She did survive the night, possibly because she chose not to succumb to selfish interests, such as getting drunk or bringing her crush over. But if she'd been responsible in a maternal way, like going up to check on the kids, being a responsible maternal figure would have killed her. Despite all this, The Sitter was one of my favorite watches for this episode, and a well-conceptualized short. You can find it on YouTube, and I'll try to put the link in the description. When a Stranger Calls might be the most obvious interpretation of the babysitter urban legend, but the most effective film to keep pieces of the legend alive can only be the 1978 smash hit Halloween, the quintessential babysitter murder movie. As we explored earlier, the anger of men against young babysitters was in full swing in the 70s, and Halloween expressed this sentiment. He's a giant deranged man with, quote, a murderous passion for sitters. So passionate about sitters that the financial backer for the movie wanted it to be titled The Babysitter Murders. The mask erases any identifying features or any sign of humanity, his wordless presence telling the audience that trying to reason with him and his senseless rage is pointless. Mikkel Koven argues that the blame for the death of the characters lies with the psychotic killer in his 2003 book The Terror Tales, Urban Legends and the Slasher Film. Now, this probably sounds incredibly obvious, but we run into the same theme over and over and over when it comes to horror movies. You have sex, you die. But Koven points out that while Annie is, quote, tardy, she's never actually seen engaging in any sexual activity. So why is she killed? Why is he attacking Laurie at all? She crossed absolutely no lines. And we are ignoring the sequels for this, as this movie was made without those future plot lines in mind. I suggest that Annie didn't die due to any sexual taboos, but because she pawned her kids off on Lori, abandoning her caretaking duties, which I always found to be a really weird arrangement in this movie, that she just abandons her paid job and pushes it onto her friend. Coven actually backs me up here. Quote, Carpenter juxtaposes both Annie's and Lori's babysitting skills. Annie is shown to largely ignore Lindsay, who is left alone, watching horror movies on a television, while Annie chats on the phone to her friends. Lori interacts much more with Tommy, reading him stories, making popcorn, carving jack-o'-lanterns together, and talking to one another. But why did he attack Lori? Possibly because of the general anger and rage towards teenage girls and their independence. The only reason she survives is because she exercises her independence in socially acceptable ways and is, quote, pure of heart. But Coven suggests another reason. Quote, Lori herself acts irresponsibly when, more concerned with her friends than her charges, leaves them asleep to go across the road to the Wallace house, where she first meets Michael. By going across the road and leaving the children unattended, Lori brings Michael back. This is interesting when you think about the implications on Michael's first murder as a child. Coven thinks that the real reason these teens are being killed isn't because they had sex, it's because they abandoned their responsibilities. Having sex was just what they decided to do after they treated their kids negligently. Michael's sister, Judith, wasn't being a responsible babysitter to her younger brother, choosing to focus on her boyfriend instead. Quote, sex is merely an extension of neglect, as a result of poor babysitting. It's absolutely no accident that Lori survives this soulless masculine rage, because, more than any other sitter in the movie, she possesses the most traits that align the closest to the acceptably feminine, as well as acceptable caretaker behaviors. Quote, Lori was romantic, lonely, and maternal, while changing sexual ideals had shaped her girlfriend's beliefs and behaviors. All Linda and Annie talked about was sex. Though a woman wrote their dialogue, the girls' sex talk made them sound a lot like guys in a locker room. Thus, Annie's sexual bravado and bitchiness got her hacked to death, while Linda, who had orgasmic sex with her boyfriend while babysitting, died a similarly violent death at the hands of Michael. As a side note, we see a more extensive use of telephones against the babysitters of this film. We see the girls all use the telephone as a way to maintain contact with each other, a comfort in the middle of a neighborhood where seemingly every adult is either absent or negligent. Well, in Halloween, Michael Myers takes the weaponization of the telephone a huge step further. First, he cuts the phone lines, literally cutting Linda off from the comfort of communication. And later, he strangles her with that telephone cord. I'm gonna level with you. If you've seen the short film The Sitter, there's really no reason to watch the 1979 When a Stranger Calls at all, unless you want a more intense musical score and better camera quality. That's because When a Stranger Calls is the film-length version of the short, both directed by Fred Walton. The first 23 minutes are an almost identical rendition, even down to the script. One of the only differences was that Jill's friend, Nancy, doesn't try to invite herself and Bobby over. Nancy admits to a crush on Bobby, but she doesn't tell Jill that no one likes to hang out with her, like in the short. It makes their friendship a lot more believable to me. The rest of the movie is a very underwhelming crime thriller, taking place 7 years later, following the escaped killer, Kurt Duncan, and the cop, now private detective John Clifford, tracking him down. Skipping irrelevant parts for this discussion, Clifford mentions at one point that Duncan had torn the children apart with his bare hands. If you see even one frame of the movie that shows this killer, you'd immediately call bullshit. This guy looks like he'd have a hard time opening a heavy door, let alone tearing bodies limb from limb. Babysitter Jill is now married, with 2 kids of her own. She and her husband leave the kids with a sitter to go out to dinner. At dinner, a staff member lets Jill know that she has a call. On the other end of the line is a question she never wanted to hear again.
Have you checked the children?
She collapses at the restaurant, her husband, Mr. Lockhart, hustling over. Now, Mr. Lockhart is kind of a rare gem in a movie of this time. He calls their sitter, who says everything's been fine at home. He cleverly tells her that if anything's wrong, if she's being held under threat by a man as they spoke, that she should just respond with the word yes. Babysitter Sharon still doesn't know what's going on. It really has been fine. When the couple races home, accompanied by the police, they find nothing wrong. Mr. Lockhart never tells his wife that she's overreacting or acting crazy, while they're surrounded by patrons of the restaurant saying things like how he needed to just hurry up and get her to a hospital because it was disrupting their dinner. He took her concerns seriously and didn't question that he needed to call everyone they had to talk to. When they get home, he reassures her that they're all home, that they're all alive. He even takes a gun out of the closet, telling her he'll keep it by his side of the bed, locked and loaded all night. Anyway, I won't recount the story through the ending, as it doesn't really have much to do with this episode. It was a slow watch after the first 20-ish minutes, and I definitely think it got its point across much more effectively when it was a short. As far as the 2006 remake, it really wasn't memorable to me either. They tried to make it more action-y, and with a handful of red herrings in an attempt to keep the audience's attention, but it doesn't really offer anything to this conversation. Friday the 13th is a unique entry in this list. At first, we see the formula that places it in the episode's discussion.
Did you know that a young boy drowned the year before those two others were killed? The counselors weren't paying any attention. They were making love while that young boy drowned. His name was Jason. Jason should have been watched every minute. He wasn't a very good swimmer. You let him drown. You never paid any attention. Look what you did to him. Look what you did to him.
Mrs. Voorhees is now out for vengeance against irresponsible counselors at large. This is also quite a shift, where we've focused the majority of our attention on the sidelined, supposedly emasculated father. Now we've shifted to the mother, who trusted her child to these independent teens with disastrous results. Pamela Voorhees acts as the personification of punishment against the failure of feminine societal roles. But here's where the formula starts to fail. The counselors that we spend the movie with never actually take care of any kids. In fact, there isn't a single child in the entire camp yet. And most of the counselors don't even have sex, never running afoul of the taboo Mrs. Voorhees condemns. So why does she kill them? Coven writes, quote, "We are once again in the realm of Halloween's implied interdiction. The yoke of responsibility cannot be easily removed. For the adolescents working at summer camps, just like the adolescents who went to see Friday the 13th upon its release, the fears surrounding the responsibility they've been given, particularly for the lives of younger children, and this time in a residential setting, unlike a few hours of babysitting, must weigh heavily on their consciousness." Whether you look at slasher movies from the perspective of anti-sex ideology or from the concept of ideal feminine behavior, it's interesting that these horror movies seem to echo conservative ideals, especially considering how much religious groups have hated horror movies. Quote, "The slasher film grows out of the severest, most strongly anti-female aspects of a very American brand of the Judeo-Christian mythology, in which woman, because of her sexual appetites, is held responsible for man's fall from grace. Woman is victimized because she's blamed for the human condition." I'm gonna interject here and say that I love many of these movies. I'm a huge horror fan. And while it can be fun to just turn on a good slasher every now and then, particularly around Halloween, I do think that these movies, and frankly any film in any genre, can be used as a snapshot and barometer of societal values at the time. I know some people argue that they don't like movies that are too thinky, that it's just a schlocky movie. But I'd argue that every movie has some cultural information to offer, and that it's important to understand the lens through which these movies are made. We don't have to agree with all of the opinions or perspectives that these films portray, but it's helpful to be aware of them. Alright guys, we still have a ways to go with the Babysitter legend. Remember to follow our socials and Ko-Fi for updates. Be safe, and have a happy Halloween!